Ethan stood in the principal's office, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. He was only 10, but the bruise blooming on his cheek felt much older, a deep purplish stain that pulled tight when he tried to smile. It was quiet in the room, too quiet, except for the principal's soft sighs and the rustle of papers. Then Richard, his stepfather, spoke. "He's just clumsy, Mr. Harrison. Kids get bumps. Nothing to see here." Richard's voice was smooth, almost bored, but Ethan heard the edge, the sharp, dismissive tone that always followed him. It was a familiar sound, a public put-down disguised as an explanation. Richard looked at the principal, then briefly, almost accidentally, at Ethan. His eyes held no warmth, just a kind of tired annoyance, as if Ethan were a fly buzzing around his head. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He just stood there, letting Richard's words wash over him, feeling them settle deep inside like cold stones. The principal, Mr. Harrison, was a kind man with worry lines etched around his eyes. He cleared his throat, a small, uncomfortable sound, and glanced at Ethan, then back at Richard. He probably saw the careful way Ethan held himself, the way his jaw was tight, even if he didn't see the true meaning behind Richard's words. Richard made it sound like Ethan was a problem, a nuisance, always getting into trouble. And in Richard's world, Ethan was exactly that. Ethan just looked at Richard. He didn't scream or argue. He didn't beg. He just held Richard's gaze with an unnervingly calm stare. It wasn't defiant, not exactly. It was something else, something deeper, a quiet understanding that settled within him. It was a look that said, "I see you." A hidden resolve began to form, a tiny tough knot tightening in his chest. He didn't need to speak. His stillness communicated everything. It was a shift, a profound one, that even Richard, caught up in his own dismissive act, might have felt if he were paying closer attention. But Richard rarely paid attention to Ethan, not in any real way. Richard turned to leave, already halfway out the door, his back to Ethan. He probably thought the whole thing was over, just another minor inconvenience dealt with. But as he turned, a low murmur escaped Ethan's lips. It was almost imperceptible, a breath, a whisper, directed only at Richard's retreating back. "This isn't over." Richard didn't hear the words, not consciously, but a shiver, cold and unexpected, traced its way down his spine. He paused for a fraction of a second, a fleeting moment of unease before pushing the principal's office door open and stepping out into the bustling hallway. He disappeared without another glance. He'd probably forget this whole thing by lunchtime. Ethan watched him go, his eyes holding a secret that was both heavy and strangely liberating. The bruise on his cheek throbbed, a dull ache that reminded him of the promise he'd just made to himself. When Richard was completely gone, Mr. Harrison turned back to Ethan, a question forming on his lips, a mixture of concern and confusion in his gaze. But Ethan simply shook his head, a small, decisive movement. His silence was more powerful than any words he could have spoken. He didn't need to explain. He didn't need to justify. He just needed to figure out what came next. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Ethan's quiet resolve wasn't born overnight. It was forged in the busy, sometimes chaotic streets of Los Angeles, a city that pulsed with a million different stories. His neighborhood was a mix of everything, a real melting pot. You had the vibrant Korean-American community, with its bustling markets and restaurants. Then just a few blocks over, other cultures blended in, all living their lives side by side. It was loud, full of smells from different kitchens, and always felt alive. In some parts, especially around the Korean shops, there was this close-knit feeling, like everyone knew everyone, a real sense of community. His early life, with his biological mother, Sarah, was like that too, full of a quiet kind of stability. Sarah worked hard, really hard, at a local diner. She was always on her feet, smelling faintly of coffee and fried food when she came home. But she always had a smile for Ethan. They had dreams, big ones, for a brighter future. Ethan remembered her talking about saving up, maybe opening her own little cafe someday. He was a sensitive kid, always had been. While other boys were playing rough, Ethan found his comfort in books. He'd spend hours lost in stories, drawing pictures of the characters, creating whole new worlds in his head. His drawings weren't just scribbles, they were detailed, full of imagination, a window into his inner world. What Ethan wanted more than anything was a stable, loving family. His biological father had left when he was very young, a hazy memory of a man who was there one day and gone the next. That left a hole, a constant ache for a father figure, for someone to protect him and be there no matter what. His dreams were simple, a sense of belonging, a feeling of being truly safe. He just wanted a normal family, a dad who would throw a ball with him or teach him how to fix things. That deep need was his biggest vulnerability, something he unknowingly carried around like a heavy secret. Then Richard came into their lives. At first, he was everything Ethan thought a father should be. He was charming, easy to talk to, and always had a good joke ready. He swept Sarah off her feet, telling her all the right things, promising her the stability she longed for. Richard presented himself as a protector, a strong man who would take care of them both. Ethan, starved for a male presence, latched onto him, seeing him as the answer to his silent prayers. Richard, slowly, almost imperceptibly, started to become part of their routine. He'd join them for dinner, help Sarah with groceries, even offer to read Ethan a bedtime story. In those early days, there was so much hope. Sarah saw a chance for a complete family, a stable home for her son. Ethan saw the father he'd always wanted. Richard played the part perfectly. He was supportive, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in their lives. But over time, that supportive presence began to shift. It was subtle at first, just little things. A look here, a comment there. The charm started to feel a bit too rehearsed, the smiles not quite reaching his eyes. He started to control things, not in an obvious way, but by making suggestions that slowly became demands. He was laying the groundwork, exploiting Sarah's desire for stability and Ethan's desperate need for a father. The emotional landscape changed, slowly but surely. Hope began to curdle into unease, then fear. Ethan, with his sensitive nature, felt it first. He saw the cracks in Richard's perfect facade, long before Sarah did. He felt the shift from genuine care to something colder, something calculating. He knew, deep down, that the man who had promised to protect them was slowly becoming the very thing they needed protection from. The perfect facade Richard had built began to crumble, not all at once, but with a slow, grinding erosion that chipped away at Ethan's trust and Sarah's peace. It wasn't just the absence of genuine warmth. It was the active disappointment, the constant letdowns that stung more than any physical blow. Richard became a master of broken promises. He'd casually mentioned taking Ethan to a Dodgers game, seeing the boy's eyes light up, only to cancel last minute with a flimsy excuse about being too tired or having an unexpected work call. It happened so often that Ethan stopped believing him entirely. But the initial flicker of hope, followed by the familiar ache of neglect, never truly went away. He'd offer to help Ethan with his homework, especially math, which Ethan struggled with, only to get frustrated quickly and tell him he was too slow, leaving Ethan feeling stupid and alone with his textbooks. These were the subtle slights, the veiled humiliations that were harder to pinpoint, but cut just as deep. Richard had a way of making Ethan feel small, often disguised as playful teasing in front of Sarah or other family members. "Look at Ethan, still drawing his little cartoons," he'd say with a dismissive chuckle, making Ethan's beloved artwork sound like childish scribbles. Or if Ethan got a bad grade, Richard would sigh dramatically. "He's just lazy, always has been, needs to apply himself." These comments, delivered with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, chipped away at Ethan's confidence, making him doubt his own abilities and worth. Sarah, caught in the middle, would sometimes try to defend Ethan, but Richard would quickly brush her off, making her feel overly sensitive or protective. Richard was also a master manipulator, especially when it came to isolating Ethan from Sarah. He started planting seeds of doubt in Sarah's mind, convincing her that Ethan was too sensitive or needed tough love to grow up strong. He'd twist Ethan's normal childhood behaviors into something problematic, making Sarah question her own parenting instincts. "He's always complaining," Richard would say, or "he just wants attention." Slowly, a wedge formed between mother and son, fueled by Richard's subtle poison. Sarah, wanting to believe in the man she loved, found herself caught in a difficult position, often unknowingly echoing Richard's criticisms of Ethan, further alienating the boy. There were countless moments of outright injustice, too. Instances where Richard would unfairly blame Ethan for things he hadn't done, or punish him disproportionately for minor infractions. One time, Ethan's art supplies went missing, and Richard immediately accused him of being irresponsible, even though Ethan swore he had put them away. Later, Richard found them in a place Ethan never would have put them, a clear setup. Another time, Ethan accidentally spilled a drink, and Richard, in a fit of manufactured anger, ripped up one of Ethan's favorite drawings, calling it a mess, and declaring that Ethan needed to learn to be more careful with things. The drawing was not the mess. It was Richard's anger. These were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern designed to keep Ethan off balance, to make him feel like he was always doing something wrong. In their diverse Los Angeles neighborhood, there were unspoken cultural expectations. Respect for elders, especially step-parents, was deeply ingrained in many communities, including the Korean-American families who lived nearby. This made it even harder for Sarah to challenge Richard initially. The idea of a blended family needing to make it work often overshadowed individual suffering, especially for a young boy. People might have noticed Ethan's quietness, his increasingly bruised appearance, but a direct intervention was often seen as interfering in family matters. This cultural nuance, while not explicitly stated, contributed to the silence that surrounded Ethan's abuse, making him feel even more trapped. The incident in the principal's office was not a random occurrence. It wasn't the first time Richard had humiliated Ethan, or the first time Ethan had carried a bruise. It was the culmination of years of emotional erosion and psychological abuse, a slow, agonizing grind that had finally pushed Ethan to his absolute breaking point. The quiet, almost calculating look Ethan gave Richard in that office was not resignation. It was the calm before a storm, the silent declaration of a child who had finally had enough. He was done being a victim. He was done with the broken promises, the veiled insults, the manipulative whispers. The bruise on his cheek was just the visible tip of an iceberg of pain, a tangible mark of the invisible wounds Richard had inflicted. The emotional atmosphere in Ethan's home didn't just get worse. It began to feel suffocating, like a heavy blanket pressed down on him. Richard's behavior intensified, moving past the subtle digs and manipulative whispers to something more open, more hostile. His neglect of Ethan became blatant, almost a performance for Sarah, as if to say, "See, he's nothing to me." Arguments between Sarah and Richard became more frequent, and they often revolved around Ethan. The house was filled with a constant, simmering tension, like a pot about to boil over. Richard's verbal abuse towards Ethan, which used to be disguised as tough love, now became outright insults, sharp words that chipped away at Ethan's already fragile sense of self. He'd call Ethan useless, stupid, or a burden, often when Sarah was within earshot, making her flinch but usually not intervene, caught between her son and the man she had chosen. Neighbors and other parents in their diverse community started to notice Ethan's withdrawn demeanor, the way he'd keep his head down, the occasional bruise that peeked out from under his shirt collar. These things didn't go unnoticed. Whispers followed him, concerned glances were exchanged, and sometimes parents would pull their own kids away from him at the park. Not because Ethan was a bad kid, but because the air around him felt heavy with unspoken trouble. This external judgment, though silent, added to Ethan's internal burden, making him feel exposed and ashamed. Sarah, too, felt the weight of these unspoken questions, her distress growing with each passing day. Richard became openly dismissive, sometimes even cruel. He started withholding small things like Ethan's allowance for chores or new school supplies, claiming Ethan didn't deserve them. There were times he'd intentionally forget to wake Ethan up for school, or accidentally spill water on Ethan's homework, making him late or unprepared. His constant presence in the house, once a source of false hope, became a source of pure fear for Ethan. Every creak of the floorboards, every slammed door, every raised voice sent a jolt of anxiety through the boy. He walked on eggshells, trying to be invisible, trying to avoid anything that might trigger Richard's anger. Ethan experienced profound emotional suffocation. He felt trapped, like he was drowning in his own home. He couldn't fully confide in his mother, who seemed so worn down by Richard's influence, and who herself was struggling to keep the family together. He felt utterly alone, isolated in his pain. The weight of his situation, coupled with the unspoken judgment from his community, created a palpable sense of despair. He would often retreat into his room, pressing his face into his pillow, wishing he could disappear. His once vivid imagination, which used to be an escape, now only conjured up worse scenarios, making his reality feel even more grim. He felt the walls closing in, pushing him towards a desperate solution. The silent scream for help was building inside him, a pressure that had to find an outlet. He knew he couldn't keep living like this, enduring the constant fear and the chipping away of his spirit. Something had to give. He just didn't know what or how, but the feeling of utter desperation was a powerful force, pushing him towards a path he never imagined he would take. He knew, deep down, that he was on the edge of a precipice, and he had to do something, anything, to save himself. One evening, the true nature of Richard's intentions unraveled in the most devastating way for Ethan. He was supposed to be asleep, but a sudden thirst had him creeping towards the kitchen for a glass of water. As he passed the living room, he heard Richard's voice, low and conspiratorial, on the phone. Ethan froze, hidden by the shadows as he listened. Richard was talking to someone, a friend perhaps, and his words cut through the quiet house like a knife. Yeah, I married Sarah for the stability, man. She's got a good job, steady income, and a house. Perfect setup, Richard chuckled, a cold, calculating sound that made Ethan's stomach churn. But that kid, Ethan, he's an unwanted burden, always underfoot, always needing something. I've been working on getting him out of the picture, making him look like the problem child. Sarah's almost convinced he needs tougher schooling, away from home. Ethan's small world shattered. It wasn't just about the bruises or the insults. It was a deliberate, planned betrayal. Richard had married his mom for money and saw him, Ethan, as a roadblock to his comfortable life. The constant put-downs, the emotional manipulation, the way Richard had created a wedge between him and his mother. It all clicked into place. It wasn't about Ethan being a bad kid. It was about Richard wanting him gone. A raw, burning anger, unlike anything he had felt before, ignited within him. The next morning, Ethan moved with a quiet determination. The despair he'd felt before was replaced by a cold resolve. He knew he couldn't tell his mom this. Richard had already poisoned her mind. He had to find help. Real help. Outside their suffocating home. He thought back to a conversation he'd overheard at school, a whispered exchange between two older kids about community leaders. One of them had mentioned Mr. Kim, a powerful figure in the local Korean community. Known for his influence and for protecting his own, they'd called him unconventional. But the way they spoke of him, it was clear he got things done. Ethan knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but he was out of options. After school, instead of heading home, he took a bus to the heart of the Korean district. The streets were bustling, filled with the aroma of spices and the chatter of a language he didn't understand. He felt small and out of place, but the memory of Richard's words propelled him forward. He found the address the kids had mentioned, a seemingly legitimate business, a large, unassuming storefront with a discreet sign that read, Kim Enterprises. He pushed open the heavy glass door, the bell above chiming softly. Inside, the space was surprisingly quiet, with dark wood and a few men in sharp suits sitting at desks, typing on computers. At the back, seated behind a large, polished desk, was a man who could only be Mr. Kim. He was impeccably dressed, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp and observant. Ethan's heart pounded against his ribs, but he walked straight towards the desk, his small frame and bruised face a stark contrast to the intimidating presence of the man. Mr. Kim looked up, his gaze sweeping over Ethan, taking in his disheveled hair, the faint discoloration on his cheek, and the desperate plea in his eyes. He didn't speak, just waited. Ethan stood before him, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He swallowed hard, his throat tight, and then, with a trembling voice that somehow held unwavering resolve, he whispered the words that would change everything. Be my dad. The words hung in the air, a profound act of desperation, a raw cry for protection. It was the narrative's key turning point, a bold move born of utter necessity, breaking the cycle of suffering and setting the stage for the dramatic consequences that were about to unfold. He had placed his last, most fragile hope in the hands of a stranger, a man rumored to be dangerous, but a man who, he hoped, could offer him the safety he so desperately craved. He had done it. The silent scream had finally found its voice. Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and terror wash over him after whispering those words. It was like jumping off a cliff, exhilarating and terrifying all at once. He had done it. He had asked for help. But from whom? A man known for his power, yes, but also for methods that were, as the older kids said, unconventional. Doubts immediately started to creep in. Had he made a terrible mistake? Was he trading one kind of danger for another? The fear of Richard was still very real, but now it was joined by a new, unsettling uncertainty about Mr. Kim and what his involvement might mean. He pictured the men in suits, quiet and watchful, and wondered what kind of world he had just stepped into. Back home, the news of Ethan's desperate plea eventually reached Sarah. Perhaps it was a quiet word from Mr. Kim's office, or maybe Ethan himself, in a rare moment of openness, told her. Her initial reaction was a mix of shock and absolute horror. Her son, her little boy, had gone to a crime boss for help? What had she allowed to happen? The guilt hit her like a physical blow. She saw the bruises, not just the fresh ones on his face, but the emotional scars that ran deeper. She replayed Richard's dismissive words, his constant put-downs, the way he subtly isolated Ethan, the denial she had clung to, the hope that things would get better, shattered completely. A fierce primal protectiveness surged through her. Richard had taken too much, and now he had pushed her son to this extreme. Sarah, who had been so timid and uncertain, transformed into a lioness ready to fight for her cub. She became Ethan's staunchest ally, her guilt fueling a fierce determination to make things right. Meanwhile, whispers started in the community. Ethan's teachers and school counselors, who had seen his withdrawn behavior and the occasional unexplained marks, now had a clearer picture. Mrs. Jenkins, his art teacher, remembered the way Ethan used to light up when he drew, and how that spark had slowly faded. Mr. Harrison, the school psychologist, recalled trying to talk to Ethan, only to be met with a wall of silence. Now, hearing about his plea, they began to piece together the puzzle, offering their support and observations, ready to back Ethan up. Richard, when he eventually caught wind of Ethan's actions, exploded with a mix of disbelief and raging fury. He couldn't believe this ungrateful brat had dared to go behind his back. He immediately tried to discredit Ethan, painting him as a troubled, manipulative child, making up stories for attention. He doubled down on his manipulation of Sarah, trying to convince her that Ethan was out of control, that Mr. Kim was a dangerous man who would only bring more trouble. Some distant relatives and acquaintances, who had always been charmed by Richard's smooth talk, were initially swayed by his version of events, expressing skepticism about Ethan's claims. They couldn't imagine Richard, the charming man they knew, being capable of such cruelty. The local Korean community, however, reacted differently. Mr. Kim's involvement sent ripples through their tight-knit world. They valued justice, and they protected their own. While some might have feared Mr. Kim's methods, many quietly supported Ethan and Sarah. They saw a child in distress, and they understood the unspoken codes of loyalty and protection. Anticipation hung in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. Ethan's psychological state was fragile, a delicate balance of hope and terror. He felt the weight of his decision, the immense pressure of the unknown future. He oscillated between moments of quiet empowerment, knowing he had finally acted, and spells of profound dread, wondering if he had just made things worse. The years of abuse had taken a deep emotional toll, leaving him scarred, but, surprisingly, also with a nascent sense of strength. He had faced his greatest fear, and in doing so, had found a voice, even if it was just a whisper. He was still just a boy, but he had done something incredibly brave, and that bravery was starting to bloom amidst the fear. The next morning, the school parking lot was a scene straight out of a movie. 40 men, all dressed in crisp black suits, stood in silent formation. They weren't aggressive, not overtly threatening, but their presence was undeniable. Richard, arriving to pick up Ethan as usual, froze. The men parted just enough for him to see Ethan, standing calmly beside Sarah, who had a determined look on her face. Mr. Kim was there too, his gaze unwavering as he met Richard's horrified eyes. This was the protection Ethan had asked for, a powerful, unconventional shield. The sight alone was enough. Richard, for the first time, looked truly afraid. He tried to bluster, to deny, but the men in black suits were a silent, immovable force. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence spoke volumes. Within hours, the legal process, which had seemed so slow and frustrating, moved with surprising speed. The school principal, now fully aware of the situation and supported by Sarah's testimony and the observations of Ethan's teachers, provided crucial evidence. Richard faced charges of child abuse and neglect. The restraining order was swift and absolute. He lost everything: his job, his reputation, and any remaining support from those who had once been charmed by him. The community, once divided, now saw him for what he truly was. Ethan and Sarah moved to a small, quiet house a few towns over. It was a fresh start, a place where they could rebuild without the shadow of Richard's cruelty. Sarah found a new job at a bookstore, a place she loved, and the steady work brought a sense of peace and stability. The new home was smaller, but it felt safe, filled with a quiet hope they hadn't known in years. Ethan started therapy, a space where he could finally talk about the fear, the anger, the confusion. It wasn't easy, but slowly, he began to process the trauma. He poured his feelings into his art, filling sketchbooks with vibrant colors and powerful images, finding a voice he hadn't realized he possessed. His bond with Sarah, forged in the fires of shared adversity, became unbreakable. They talked, they laughed, they healed together. Mr. Kim never officially became Ethan's dad, but his influence was constant and reassuring. He was a silent guardian, a watchful presence. Occasionally, a small, anonymous package would arrive for Ethan. New art supplies, a book he'd mentioned, a gift certificate for a local museum. Ethan knew where they came from. He never saw Mr. Kim directly after that day at school, but he felt his protection, a quiet strength that allowed him to feel safe. It was a different kind of family, an unexpected one, but it was real. Years passed. Ethan grew into a thoughtful, resilient young man. The scars of his past remained, not as open wounds, but as faint lines that reminded him of how far he had come. He carried the strength he found in his darkest hour, the courage to speak out, even in a whisper. He learned that justice could take many forms, sometimes conventional, sometimes not. He understood that a single act of desperation could ignite a powerful chain of events, leading to healing and a chance at a true life. He looked at his mother, her face softer now, filled with a quiet joy, and knew that they had made it. They had found their peace, their family, their home. And sometimes he'd catch himself drawing a small, subtle symbol in his sketchbooks, a quiet nod to the unexpected protector who had shown him that even in the darkest moments, help could come from the most unlikely places.